Our guest today is poet Greg Fraser. He is the author of two poetry collections, Strange Pieta and Answering the Ruins. He is also the co-author with Chad Davidson of the workshop textbook Writing Poetry, Creative and Critical Approaches, and the composition textbook Analyze Anything, a guide to critical reading and writing. His poetry has appeared in literary journals including the Paris Review, the Southern Review, and Plowshare. He is the recipient of a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts and serves as Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing at the University of West Georgia. And also, he is the Georgia Author of the Year. I guess he also, actually, I should add, he also just had little children, two at a time. He had twins recently in the summer, so poor Greg is not sleeping very much, he told me. Still not sleeping very much.
Yeah.
But anyway, please welcome Greg.
Thank you for having me. Well, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I've gotten used to waking up in the middle of the night and I look at the clock and it says 3:30 and I think, oh, that's just normal, you know. I'll bet you my students are up right now, you know, cramming for their exams or writing their papers or their poems or whatever they're doing. As I was driving here from Carrollton, which is out west, I was trying to think which poems to read for you guys today. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Brigitte came out to our campus and gave a wonderful reading. And if you know her work, it's highly lyrical, okay? She's a real singer. And I thought I might sort of offer a contrast to that. I tend to be less lyrical and more narrative as a poet. I've, written lyrical poems. She's written narrative poems. We all do, a variety of things, but I would probably say that my predominant thrust would be narrative, okay? And that's, I think, a good thing to think about when you go to a poetry reading or you're writing your own poems. Those are the sort of two great avenues of poetic expression, right? The song, which might begin with like work songs or labor songs, right? And the story, as it were, which has its roots in the epic, right? The long Homeric epic or epics from all around the world. All cultures have these two main strains of poetry. If you want to access a wonderful, startling, exciting lyrical poet, buy some of Brigitte's books and study her work, imitate it, and you'll be singing like you've never sung before. If you want to look at some narrative poems, well, I kind of lean in that direction. So Brigitte asked me to bring a couple books along in case anyone wanted to purchase, and I did dutifully. My first book, Strange Pieta, I will sell for $5 today. And my new book, Answering the Ruins, I'll sell for $10. They list for higher, but it's often good, I think, to try to have students access poetry. And, if you came up and you just begged and said, look, I don't even have $5, I'd probably give you a copy if you made a strong enough argument, or if you had $2. Because it's so important to put, I think, contemporary poems in the hands of as many people as possible. We tend not to read poetry much anymore as a culture. We have other forms of literature and entertainment that tend to excite us, but poetry's still alive, and I think that's really important to know and to look into and to write it. The great German poet Rainer Maria Rilke said, "To be 18 is to be a poet." Right? When you're young, you write poems. That's part of your duty. So do it. Write lyrical poems, write narrative poems, just write poems. So my first book, Strange Pietà, centers on the birth of my brother. He was born with spina bifida in 1970, and he died in 2004. He was supposed to only live about 18 months, but he lived for 35 years. He was profoundly mentally and physically disabled. He was in a wheelchair his whole life, and doctors, psychologists would suggest that he maybe in his 30s had the mind of a 6-year-old or something like that. I don't know how they make those determinations, but he had a wonderful life, and we had a wonderful life with him. But of course, our culture, has kind of ambiguous responses to people like Jonathan, my brother. Often piteous responses, and sometimes kind of revulsive responses. I mean, he had a very hearty laugh, so if we'd go out to dinner, he could really, sort of disrupt the room, and people would turn and stare, and there was always this kind of quality that he was an outsider, or even an outcast sometimes. So several of the poems, the thrust of the book concerns Jonathan's life, our life as a family, trying to navigate our social lives and our familial lives with him. And I will read one poem about John's life. It's called Downtime, and it's about his life as a laborer. Right? He worked. He would do all kinds of things for the state of Pennsylvania. He would put nuts and bolts in little plastic bags that would go into bookcases or things like that we would purchase. He would file things. He had a lot of different jobs, and it was pretty cool. But every once in a while, the work would stop, and the people, other disabled figures, would kind of sit around with really nothing to do, and have to pass the hours during downtime when the labor stopped. So I will read that poem, maybe in a couple poems. The first one I'm going to read is called Coward, and it's not connected to Jonathan at all, but I think it'll set the narrative tone of the reading today. Okay? Coward. There's a coward in every eavesdropper. I never realized that until one summer night the trucker who lived next door steered his rig up the gravel drive home from the long haul to work over his wife. Through the hum of the window fan I heard a crash of glass, the splintered sound of a busted chair, and lay in bed alone, praying it would stop, listening to her body being thrown against hard luck. I knew that doing nothing is always doing something, and that nothing in this case was something hurtful to a woman getting her share just then. I reached for the bedstand phone. What I didn't know was this, that nothing was going to make it stop, that in a minute I'd be setting the receiver back, undialed, telling the part of myself that suddenly needed to hear it, how I should mind my own business, it wasn't my fault, there were hotlines, shelters, she should call, leave the monster. Trying not to listen, rips of cloth, a muffled cry, yet straining still to hear, I began to wonder what could lead a man to this. A road paved with what? The constant smack of bugs on windshield glass, dead without knowing what hit them, the air just stopping short. The double yellow line at night, blurred to a single stream, like a piss held in painfully, then suddenly let loose in Tulsa or Des Moines. Or the grind of the same 12 gears up and down, over and over, a form of butchery in itself. Some dishes broke, and I couldn't take it anymore. Pulled a pillow over my head. Hemorrhoids, back trouble, the threat of jackknifing in the rain. After, I thought I heard her on the stoop, mumbling words of, could it possibly have been shame? It sounded like shame, but now I know that was only me throwing my voice. Next morning, the rig was gone, out on the turnpike, its chrome front end beating down the distance, knocking the wind out of the nation again. My neighbor stood on her porch, studying the hedges gemmed with dew between our lots. I opened the door, bent for the newspaper, glanced her way. Her face was a map he'd drawn to guide him back to the crappy little town inside himself, that hellhole without a sheriff or a name. Population, 1 or 0, hard to say. She looked at me and smiled, the kind of polite smile that instead of opening a bridge holds up a sign that reads, in essence, closed for repairs. The hollows of her eyes told me that of all the things he'd beaten out of her, it was the hope that things might change that hurt the worst. I wanted to show compassion, say something kind, prove all men weren't scum. That was before I'd learned how worthless consolation is, comforting those in anguish less than those at an awkward loss for any truly helpful words. A school bus rumbled past, screeched to a halt at the end of the block, inhaled some kids. I watched until it pulled away, making sure the driver took the corner wide enough, missed the curb. Okay, that was coward. Now I got to go to my list here. Sorry, I sort of ended up in front. All right, so that's a kind of older poem, and this is a new one. I've never read this one before in public, so I may stumble. The Theft. Again, narrative. A few weeks into my first semester at the Central Pennsylvania college I would party myself out of in less than a year, I stole my roommate's girlfriend with a kiss one cold, starless night outside our dorm, or put more truly, she threw a leg across and borrowed me like an unchained bike and rode away from him. Even though she dropped me, too, not long after, or let's say she leaned me gently against a tree, it bothers me to this day that he packed for the family farm, never to return. Some nights I lie awake and think of him behind the wheel, sky the color of denim, horses in the distance, grazing on the distance. How he must have cursed me every mile from school to home. Her name was Judy, his Eric, I can't remember mine. I can bring back only the ramen noodles stacked higher than books on our shelves, the guitar I picked at all the time, a musical scab, and his scuffed up golf set in the corner he'd tried out and made the team with ease. He wrote asshole in magic marker on my leather satchel before he left. And of course I couldn't blame him, but blamed him nonetheless, telling the guys on the floor what a naive fool he was, a simple farm boy, until he entered our collective memory, then our communal forgetting. Judy, I have no doubt, runs a law firm now, her dark eyes set on justice. And some nights when sleep won't come, I think of Eric as a tall, thick-wristed kid just out of high school who could drive a tractor, track a deer, and hit a golf ball farther than any man in his county. In my dream for him, he keeps his feelings locked up for years inside a cabin in the woods, but lets them out at last, stunned and blinking, when he meets the perfect woman, what would you say, working the ticket booth at a summer fair. But other nights, when dreams won't come, I fear he married within a month the girl he brought to the prom. They get on fine, steadily if blandly, raise some kids, until the day the vision returns, and Eric sees himself in the second-story window looking down on Judy and me leaning in. That's when, in disgust, he bites his lip and throws a hand in the air, dismissing his wife and children, the life he's built, with the gesture of a golfer tossing up a pinch of grass to test the inclination of the wind. Oh, thank you. A rarity to receive applause at a poetry reading. Thank you so much. Okay, now that poem, Downtime. All right? Ooh, if I can find it. There it is. So the factory's not really working, right? And all the guys and the women are sitting around kind of with nothing to do. You know, they would normally be doing kind of small, simple manual labor, but now they're just biding their time. Downtime. Over Sunday supper, lasagna and garlic bread, my brother tells us with some heavy prompting what work is like, how it feels to make a buck, which is double his hourly wage. He spills out a roll call of fellow workers, Colby, Simon, Dwayne, his best friend, Sean, a dozen men hunched around a table, stuffing envelopes, packing shoe shine kits, counting out wing nuts, then ziplocking 10 in a bag. My mother passes the salad, father the wine, while I elicit stammers about a motley crew, the salvage of auto wrecks, Huntington's, Down syndrome, hunkering down to business, concentrating on the task at hand, each of their faces soon a sweatshop in itself. Lemons, Plato would have deemed them, had he written in our republic. It isn't long, though, never is, before my brother's thoughts grow cluttered with sudden absences, random erasures, and the dim recesses of his mind become his mind again, words trailing off, eyes wandering aimlessly after them. This time I follow too, working backwards from the periods of his pupils, joining the sentence fragments and stunted syllables making up his recollections. I wake in his craftmatic bed, feel the live-in aide shake one shoulder to rouse him. I am there when she hoists both arms and pulls a sweater tightly down until his head passes safely through the birth canal of a turtleneck. At the shop all day, I hover beside him, the Virgil in me longing to offer advice, a helping hand, but somehow I sense my need to make perfect, improve on my brother's efforts is just another form of affliction. A bolt flies from his fingers, rattles on cold concrete, sour notes my brother doesn't hear, and I wonder how many times down on two good knees someone in this nation of endless goods has slammed a fist against the floor and railed when the bag of parts for a child's first two-wheeler, a new bookcase for the den, lacks a vital lock washer, nut, or screw. How many have leaped to feet that won't fail them now and maybe never, dialed a toll-free number, vented their healthy spleens on some claims department clerk? I have, and I've had to learn to swallow that frustration for the castor oil it is. No machines at fault. My brother's defects deserve the blame, and I am here to vouch for them, for his damaged goods that cannot be returned no matter which receipt was saved, after birth or ward's delivery bill. I'm here to speak for a grown man of 33, a grown man, so to speak, rolling back his chair, his four-wheeler, at the close of the day and spotting the bolt that left a hole in another's life, disabled some best-laid plans. Won't he look down on himself who can't stand up, bend over to retrieve the errant steel? Don't get me wrong. I'm not sure if any one man's suffering should be doled out for all to taste. Yet I feel obliged to raise a voice for working stiffs when these are my brother's index fingers, pinkies, thumbs. A year ago, when state funds hit a drought, but the men still had to report for work, my brother kissed Sean on the mouth, then groped his crotch. I can't tell you how often I've envisioned my brother's hands, the bad one and the worse, parked on that workshop bench, idling like a pair of 18-wheelers in a truck stop lot, waiting for industry to lurch into gear again, then moving down, at last, to his own lap, the edge of action. Or how frequently I've eavesdropped on his dream of desire, his thirst to give and receive just one caress without pity in it, for one hand through his hair, not serving as a comb, one to hold, not for balance in the tub or support while some injection needles in. I've tried my best to imagine what it must be like for him, never to have sipped from a lover's cup, or suffered the hangover after lust's intoxications. And I've questioned whether any theft is more forgivable than a stolen kiss, if any move toward intimacy is false. They suspended my brother for 30 days, made him humble himself before Sean, learn that form of compensation. Do you suppose his apology came across like most? I bet it did, in a muffled voice, as if spoken from behind a closet door. I'll wager even he knows it's best for shame to leave the self through cracks and keyholes. Now a shadow falls across my brother's face from somewhere behind it. A glimmer, perhaps, of remembrance, the forced labor of patience, the hours losing their perfect roundness, stretching into encephalitic shapes, the clock another cripple in the room. He seems about to speak, then utters nothing, letting vacancy talk for him. It's getting late. My mother's up to her elbows in soap suds and pots, and Dad has wheeled his third and final son into the den. They'll sing along for half an hour to Kenny Rogers, then drive the few hushed miles to the small apartment my brother shares with another ward of the state. Maybe tonight I'll tag along, tuck him into bed, not leave it to someone who gets paid to. Perhaps I'll kiss my brother good night, wish him a productive week, full of pleasurable occupations. Thank you. All right, here's another new one. And I'll bet you everyone in the room has had a friend or a family member who's had some kind of fixation or obsession or addiction from which they can't break free. This poem's called The Stuff, and it addresses that issue. The Stuff. The night he swerved his Honda into a gully and dialed me up for help, I drove out ready to shove him into the mud-slick ditch, call him a reckless ass, and spit in his face what I knew he knew far better than any midnight friend, that the stuff was going to kill him, sooner than later, maybe someone else, maybe a family as well. But when at last I found him off Highway 5, chilled and apologetic under a moth-eaten blanket of sky, I couldn't bring myself even to scoff or shake my head. He seemed so small, far off, as if seen through a telescope turned backwards. And he was my mentor, let's not forget. We stood for a minute in silence, he swaying pine-like, me looking down the road for cops, then into the muscled distance of Black Hills. I could hear the wind leaf nervously through its books, searching on my behalf for a timely piece of wisdom that might miraculously cure the man if only axioms weren't dead white males. I don't know, he slurred, how to thank you, and I came this close to saying quit, but only cracked a smile, one meant to make me appear too worldly wise to judge. In fact, I was thinking judgmentally about the beer that made him grabby, wine that drew out song, and the bourbon with its taste of sun-bleached leather tightening the belt. And earlier, I lied. I drove out ready to bust him once sharply in the teeth, to watch blood, not more regrets, trickle from his mouth. Wasn't that the mouth that told me I could do anything with my life, anything on the page? Hadn't he suggested in a poem of his own that our spirits are so radiant they throw shadows of flesh and bone? Really, he said, I mean it. But I could hardly hear him. Already I was on my back, keeping my hands moving with the chains, hooking them to the frames underneath our bumpers, working to pull him free. Good? Okay. Two more poems from this book. I was teaching at St. John's University on September 11, 2001. St. John's is in Queens, New York City. I was teaching a poem by William Wordsworth, and someone opened the door and said that 2 planes had just crashed into the World Trade Center. My students and I walked out, stood on the hill, and watched the towers burn down. This is a poem that emerges from that context. Now, I know that no one in this room has ever even thought about committing plagiarism. I know I myself never have. But the figure in this poem is suspected of cheating. Okay? And the title of the poem is Cheat. The student in this poem is suspected of cheating. Cheat. Hang-ups in the dead of night, and after training ourselves to unplug before bed, crank calls at chance hours throughout the week. We didn't want to stir up conflict, hassle with running a trace, and spent the summer waiting for one lunacy to run its course. Then, after the towers crumbled, nothing. My wife had failed a finance major, ruining his plan to graduate that May. Appeals, apologetic, cajoling, gave way to threats of litigation against our school. I didn't know I could still run, an old man cloaked in dust, coughed to a TV crew, awed by his breathless luck. And still I see my 20 freshmen on that campus hill in Queens, pleased with their release from Tintern Abbey, then stunned by the twin smokes climbing. My wife, the Miltonist, refused to budge, pointing out the all too obvious in the senior's copied essay. It was late October before we noticed the calls had stopped, and didn't he complain of losing an internship downtown? In our agnostic way, half-conscious, tinged with the self-parodic, we prayed that this whining cheat, with his sense of entitlement, hadn't burned or been crushed by rubble. He did have a pleasant smile, and was his crime really such a disgrace? We watched the clock, kept ears pricked over toast and coffee, until he nearly became the son we never had, whose memory needed tending. Who's to say our number all along wasn't picked at random by a lonesome freak who simply quit one day? Still, neither of us dared to mention what I shrieked one August night, rabid, moon in my eye, "Die, you little shit," assuming his to be the hostile silence on the opposite end of the line. Last poem. This one requires just a couple preamble comments, and then we'll get it underway. The speaker in the poem talks of majoring in dendrology. That's in the first line. Dendrology is the study of trees. There's some sort of fancy English teacher references in here we probably want to get to. Malden is a part of England, a small town in England where a famous Anglo-Saxon battle took place, a lot of bloodshed there. So the Battle of Malden might be a poem you'd study in English class. That's mentioned. There's a little French phrase in here from the 15th century French poet François Villon, right? It runs, and Brigitte can probably help with the pronunciation here, but certainly the translation. Où sont les neiges d'antan? Which typically is translated into English, where have gone the snows of yesteryear? Where have gone all the old memories and the good times and the great old days, kind of thing? Is that fair enough? All right. For our purposes, it'll work. There's some references to poets and whatnot. Pinus nigra and Catalpa speciosa are Latin names for trees. We'll get to that. This sounds like a very high-minded poem, but you'll see it isn't much at all. And let's see, maybe there's, one other reference. There's a fellow in Beowulf, the epic Anglo-Saxon poem, called Unferth, who's kind of He badmouths our hero Beowulf at one point. And I think that's all the fancy stuff we have to knock out. Okay, title of this piece is called Poetry is Stupid. I was majoring in dendrology and girls, failing both. So when my hated roommate burst in from English class, slammed down his book bag and declared, "Poetry is stupid, it does nothing for the world," I knew I'd found my calling. One look at his composition, scrawled in red like a field at Malden, I smirked and hit the stacks, came back loaded down, Milton, Dickinson, Auden, Rich. He whined for days, calling the teacher idiot, bitch, recounting his unbroken string of high school A's. Où sont les neiges d'antan? I despised his loafers, Izod shirts, smooth persuasion of hair, and envied with a numbing ache the queue of beauties he ushered in, cueing me with a nod to beat it. I'd slump off to the student center, pour through Howl, Homeric hymns, repeating the mantra beneath my breath, poetry is stupid. Second term, I traded Pinus nigra for Robert Frost, Catalpa speciosa for Sexton and Plath, and slowly, as Middle Pennsylvania thawed, the notebooks filled. Tonight I lose my birthweight in sweat alone, sip the matter of my fall in rye, chew the cattle's flesh, spin like a spider the lace of verse. Recitation vexed the jerk. Cut that shit, he'd snap from his annexed 2/3 of our space. Rumor has it he made a killing in the dot-com boom. They say he even clanged the bell one morning at the stock exchange. Gross tintinnabulations. In my mind's eye, though, I place him in a smaller scene, purchasing a birthday gift for his wife, the third. He browses down the wrong aisle in a Barnes & Noble and spotting my name along one spine, double takes and says out loud, "Hey, I roomed with that hand job freshman year." Then he cracks the slender volume, peruses till he finds the poem, this poem, dedicated to none other than him, my adversary, my antonym, my unferth, my muse. Thank you for coming.
I found with narrative poetry, in particular lengthier narrative poetry, that the hard thing is, and for students as well, when you teach creative writing, the hard thing is to try and teach them what not to include.
Right.
Because they get going on a story, or you or I get going on a story, and it's how do you determine what seems interesting to you versus what's going to be interesting to the reader?
Right.
And I've noticed that a lot of your poems are in not line length form, but stanza length form.
Yeah.
Is that a tool you use to sort of help you structure the poem in that way?
Yeah, I think in graduate school I had a great Romanticism professor who always said, selection is meaning. That was his little mantra. You know, he always made you think, okay, remember that the poet or the writer has selected out what to include. But there's a lot of stuff that has been, left to the side. And so the meaning comes with what has been selected. And I think poets, especially probably poets, because of the formal possibilities in poetry, come up with these nonce rules sometimes, nonsense rules, or more traditional rules for curtailing the story, for giving it some shape, and for knowing what to leave out. Right? That's just as important, right, as what you include, I think. And we need some structure in order to help us with those decisions. Of course, I think we also have to understand that a lot of times we just include things in poems because we need to in order to get to the next section. And every poem doesn't have to be perfect. I think you learn that after a while. Like, sure, I go back to poems in my first book and I think, oh my God, how could I include that? Or this line's just got to go. And I remember Robert Haas, a great American poet, once said, your first book should be an absolute failure. If you're going to be a writer for a long time, your first book, you're best off if it's just a dud. If you win the National Book Award, it's impossible. You have nowhere to go. after that. And there's too much pressure, you know, so kind of your rookie book, it's okay to miss some steps, right? Include things that you might, on later reflection, wish you'd taken out. But looking upon those earlier sections or passages and thinking, you know, okay, I might cut it out now, but I needed it back then. I had to include it back then. I was younger, I didn't have the experience, but it got me from point A to point B in this narrative. And I think that's okay sometimes. But yeah, I think you often need some kind of shaping mechanism, some kind of fashioning tool to keep it moving along down a stream with banks rather than just a marshy area where everything's included. Yes, sir?
You were saying something about revising.
Yeah.
In a typical book that you write, how many times do you go back and revise with the publisher? How many times do you got to go back and forth?
Well, you know, publishing in this day and age is pretty different than it used to be. You know, the sort of mythic vision of publishing, and at least in American culture, it's probably different in French, or maybe it's the same, but I don't know if you guys have ever studied the Lost Generation writers of the early 20th century, this kind of modernist writer whose names sort of, you know, are like marquee names in American literature, Langston Hughes or Ernest Hemingway or Zora Neale Hurston or F. Scott Fitzgerald, people like that, right? And you take somebody like Fitzgerald or Hemingway, but Fitzgerald's probably a pretty good example. He had an editor named Maxwell Perkins at Scribner's. And Perkins was this consummate reader. He was a highly intelligent editor who had just a super subtle sense of what literature could do. And the writers whom he edited, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Thomas Wolfe, several others, they really counted on Perkins to guide them, to help make some of the choices you're describing. If you read the letters between Perkins and, say, Fitzgerald, you know, they're arguing and quibbling over certain sections, and Perkins is always like, you don't need this. And Fitzgerald's like, well, but I really like the writing here. And Perkins would say, I do too, but you don't need it for the novel. It's slowing down the novel, move more quickly, point A to point B, okay? That's the kind of, and so we imagine this wonderful relationship with the editor who's guiding you and, you know, helping you make those choices, etc. It doesn't exist anymore. You know, the cliche nowadays that publishing is now printing, right? That if they accept your book, they print it, right? They don't talk to you about, you know, the arrangement of the poems or possible revisions or that kind of thing. They don't have time for that. Editors aren't working with the language of the poems or the novel. They're acquisition editors. They're out looking for new books. That's how they spend their time. It's much more corporate, okay, in its mindset now. Okay, it's very driven by profit and stockholder expectations, okay? Where, you know, I mean, I don't want to pull out the golden age of publishing and say, well, back in the old days it was much truer and more noble and all that stuff. It was still about the money. But if you look at some of that correspondence, you realize it's not just about the money. It's about the art, too. And I think that's still true today, but to a lesser extent because of the pressures of the corporate environment. Not because the editors aren't as good. Okay, they are. But just they don't have a really opportunity anymore. So a long way of answering your question is that, you know, I put the book together pretty much on my own, but in concert and collaboration and conversation with other figures like your professors here. You know, friends of mine who are poets who help me arrange, revise, etc. So that kind of conversation has fallen to other artists. It was always that way, of course. The editor's kind of out of the loop at this stage. So you do all that work in advance, and then the publisher ends up kind of printing it. But I think that's a reductive way of describing the relationship, because I have a very good relationship with my editor, and he did make some arrangement, or raised some questions at least about arrangement and certainly some inclusions. He cut a few poems, but that's pretty rare. And I've known him for a long time, so we're pretty close at this stage. I think, you know, he put in the extra time to help me with that in my second book. But my first book was just, you know, this is the way it is. We like the book. We're going to publish it. Is that a fair enough answer? at least it points you to some really interesting correspondence, and that is the correspondence with Max Perkins and some of his writers in the early 20th century. If you don't know that, it's really wonderful stuff. Ah, Il Presidente.
El Professor.
Hey, Tim. How you doing? Tim and I.
Better than I deserve.
Yeah. Other question or comment? Or yes?
How do you expand on it? Say you have something that's good to start out with, but you're not quite there yet.
Yeah, that's a great question, you know. And I'm actually a pretty good person to ask that question of, because I tend to be an expansionist as a writer, okay? Meaning I like to overwrite and just, you know, pile on and pile on and pile on, and then figure out how to cut it back, okay? I don't write to form, meaning, you know, if somebody gave me an assignment, write a 20-line poem, right, about, you know, childhood experience or something like that, I would write 150 lines and then whittle it down to 20, okay? A lot of poets, you know, they have a different mentality. They're going to use the box of the 20 lines, that constraint, to really force them to make choices as they go along, right? They, in the textbook that Dr. Davidson and I published, Writing Poetry, it's called, we talk about this distinction. Two kinds of approaches. One, what we call a readerly approach, which moves down the page just as you would read a poem, right? First line, you write it as you would read it. So you start with the first line, you move to the second line, you go to the third line, and you kind of make your choices as you go along, and then, bing, it's done at the end, 20 lines, okay? A writerly approach, at least in our argument, tends to overwrite, tends to pile on, and then select out down to the 20 lines. And that tends to be my method, okay? Because I like to sort of just find some surprises along the way. You know, some weird leaps or some jumps, some incongruous pieces that I can somehow strangely fit together. That's what's exciting for me in the writing. And I need a wide canvas in order to figure out what those things might be. I tend not to be able to write as I go down the page. I have several friends who do it that way. My good friend Bob Hickok, who's a wonderful poet, and you should look at some of his stuff. He writes right down the page, you know, figures it out as he goes, and I just don't know how he does it. But I would say, you know, to answer your question, range freely for a while. Test out that method. Range freely. And don't worry about making connections, or don't worry about a subject matter too early on. Set up a wide canvas, and then let the language, let the imagery or the circumstances that you discover along the way on your big rough canvas, let them guide you on where a poem might be in that big forest. At least that's how I approach it. Now, like the poems I read, they seem kind of pretty sort of neat and compacted, right? But they didn't start out that way. I saw a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Do you find that most of your inspiration comes from like real life situations? I mean, are most of your poems, I guess, autobiographical? Or?
Some are. My earlier ones, especially, I would say yes. But autobiography is an interesting term, you know, in this context, because of course, as soon as life experience hits the page, it becomes something different, right? I mean, it's shot through with embellishment, of course, but it's shaped in ways that life isn't really shaped, right? I mean, we're just kind of, here we are having a conversation here in this room, you know, and it's a Tuesday afternoon, and, you know, we're kind of teasing out some thoughts about poetry, etc. But when we actually make art of any kind, music, painting, sculpture, poems, novels, you know, we always have to remind ourselves of the artifice inscribed within art, right? So think about a poem like Coward, the first one I read. Did that actually happen to me the way it comes across in the poem? No. Have I ever overheard domestic abuse in a community situation? Yes. Right? So it's kind of like you sort of pick and choose different parts of your life, perhaps, but you're always honoring the artifice, the making, okay, of the work. And I think that's probably primary, right? I mean, the autobiographical experience might be a stimulus. It might sort of say, well, you know, maybe I can shape a poem around an experience like that. But it's never journalism, right? It's never simply a recording of events. And even memoir and autobiography proper as genres, shot through with lots of embellishment. Probably in a ratio of 80 to 20, I would say. 20% fact, 80% art. Other writers in the room want to confirm that ratio or revise? I don't know. That would be my guess. Yeah.
I have a question. How much do you know when you start a poem? How much is it more likely that you know you want to say something in particular, or is it a discovery along the way?
Discovery along the way.
Almost always?
Almost always. Yeah, almost always. There's a lot of sort of writing training, writing pedagogy, writing discussion about this question. It's an ancient question and just a totally vital one. And I think it's a question that should breed, an answer that includes hybridity. It's never one or the other. It's not a binary, right? But because like in your everyday life, you think about all kinds of things you want to say, right? Like you just make an observation, right? And you think, okay, yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to test that out on my friends, or maybe I'll test that out in a poem. But to begin the poem with that observation, I think, at least for my process, usually is the kiss of death. Because it begins with an idea, begins with a subject matter, and the writing can be a little bit stiff, right, or unsurprising to the writer, him or herself, if you sort of know in advance what it is you want to write. I'm much more inductive in my process. I want to just kind of get that canvas out and then just kind of look inside that big canvas and think, oh, wow, that connects with that. And that allows me, in a context that isn't pre-planned, to say this comment I have over here in my big canvas. So a lot of what happens is a lot of journal writing, a lot of note-taking, all day long, or all week long. You're just scribbling and scratching and building your junkyard, as it were, and then looking for ways to connect sections, but not knowing in advance what it is you necessarily want to talk about. Allowing yourself to discover along the way. Robert Frost said, if you're not surprising yourself in the writing process, you'll never surprise a reader. And I believe that. I believe that. Yes?
You were saying that your editor doesn't actually edit your work. So who do you trust to edit your work before you submit it to publish?
That's a great question. I have a few very close poet friends who always see my stuff. Chad Davidson, who works with me as a colleague of mine, he's probably my primary reader. And I think most poets have a primary reader. Okay, one person whom they would trust above all to give the final sort of say about a piece or about a book even. But I have others, people I went to graduate school with, right? People who were trained with me along the way, right? And because you sort of share a certain aesthetic vision, or put in simpler terms, what counts as beautiful or what counts as valid, right? You kind of have some touch points, divergences too, but at least some common ground, familial ground, as it were, where you can kind of trust those people and who might say, well, this section could go, or this poem doesn't really work for me, it doesn't seem to fit into the larger context of the book, and you just kind of trust them, because I often say this to students, one of the greatest dangers in a writing life is isolation, okay? If you believe that a writer simply sits in a room and cranks out poems or novels or stories, you really don't know what the writing life is like, okay? It's much more collaborative. It has many, many moving parts, okay? It's not simply that recluse, in a small room, darkened room with no distractions, right? Just the blank page and a pen, right? That is a version of hell on some level, right? I mean, if you sit down, you try it for a week, right? You just sit down with a blank page and a pen, right? And you'll just fall into that blank page and just get sucked down into that vortex and stop writing, You know, if you're not sharing your work, discussing ideas, having your ideas and your poems rub up against some resistance, but also receive some praise, you know, it's communal in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean people write your poems for you, right? You write them, but you write them in a context. You write them with certain readers in mind, certain ideal readers, readers whom you trust. I think it's often a good idea to find a reader whose work is radically different from your own, okay? And yeah, I mean, it's good to have people who are similar, right? Because that gives you the sort of, that familial sense of belonging, right? That keeps you going, okay? But it's often good to provoke yourself a little bit and hear what others have to say who have a different aesthetic, okay? Who might be strongly lyrical or more experimental or non-narrative, right? Someone who might write in a journal, I hate narrative, right? I want to get my poems in that person's hands on some level, as long as I trust that person and he isn't just going to like rage against narrative for its own sake, right? But who really cares about the art of poetry and understands that narrative is part of that art, right? But I can see someone writing, I hate narrative, and still offer a lot to me as a writer, to shake me out of some of my complacencies, or to wake me up from some of the things that I'm more comfortable with, right? You want to be a little bit uncomfortable, I think, in the writing process. But you don't want to make that discomfort one of loneliness and isolation. Get out, make friends, have contact with your teachers, go to office hours, meet with your writing pals outside of school, and build regularity in your practice. Try to write, I tell my students, at least a half an hour every 2 days, okay? That's not too much. I don't think that, people who tell you, oh, you know, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write from 5 to noon, have lunch, and then start again, you know, from 1 to 5, then you'll be a writer. I just don't buy it. You know, you can sustain that for about 4 or 5 days, okay? And then you got 6 months off, you know, where nothing's happening, right? And then you gear up again for your big 4 days. No. Small little bits of productive work over long periods of time. That's what makes you a publishable writer, I think. Hemingway was a raging alcoholic and would be drunk by 10 a.m. every day, okay? But he got up at about 5 a.m. every day and did his 200 words. That's what he just tried to bang out every day. 200 words, that was his thing, okay? As soon as he got his 200 words, straight to the bottle, all right? Every day, he would end his 200 words in the middle of a sentence, okay? So it would be like, and then she, and then he would stop. Go hit the bottle, you know, do his Hemingway thing. Not a model to follow, by the way. He ended up pointing a shotgun at his own face and pulling the trigger with his toe. You don't want that life, okay? But his practice of regularity is something to model a writing life on. Okay, he wrote every day, but 200 words, that's not that much. That's like 3/4 of a typed page in double space. Not that much, okay? But his trick was never seal off the paragraph. Always end your writing day in the middle of a sentence. Why? Because the next day he would have to finish that sentence, and it would pick him up again in the morning. With his blistering hangover and all of his regrets from the night before, he would still have to finish that sentence, and then boom, he would be off for his 200 words. And then as soon as he got in the middle of that sentence after 200 words, straight to the bottle again. Cut out the bottle and practice the regularity, and you'll be in business. Okay? Fitzgerald was a big drinker too, died at 40. All right? I'm 47. Right? Do I seem like that old to you? No. I'm 47. I lived 7 years longer than F. Scott Fitzgerald. Why? Because they partied themselves into the ground. They got cirrhosis of the liver. They got heart disease. They got the boom. They just died, keeled over. Way too young. Stupidly. Way too young. They had a lot more great work in them. They cut themselves off. And people will say, yeah, but they needed that life to be great artists. Bullshit. They needed regularity in the morning, 200 words, every day or every other day. That's what made them artists. Questions, comments? Concerns? That's like a spot-on hour right there. How about that? Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. I got a few books.